Welcome to Cherokee Coffee Talk. Today I have a very unique Cherokee Nation citizen, at-large citizen from New Mexico. I have David Montgomery with us today. David, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Jeff?
Oh, not bad at all. Not bad. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're into physics. You came from NSU when you first started out. You've done a lot of amazing things in the science industry and research and publications. So I find it very fascinating. One thing I like to do is learn a little bit more about different citizens, what they do, their passions, and then we go into talking about family.
Okay, great. So, my name is David Montgomery. I was born and raised in West Tulsa in the Red Fork community. I attended NSU from 1981 to 1984. I started off actually pre-med, and the biology and chemistry was a lot of memorization, and I found out biology was a lot more icky than what I had anticipated. And so we didn't have physics in my high school. We just had like math and biology and chemistry. So my first exposure to physics was in college, and I just fell in love with it. And so whenever I graduated in 1984, I really wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life still and how I was going to grow up. I had a job offer basically as an electronics engineer. I had another job lead in the petroleum industry as a petroleum engineer. And I've been accepted to graduate school at the University of Oklahoma, their engineering physics program. And there was this offer on the table. There was a recruiter from Lawrence Livermore National Lab out in the Bay Area who would come to NSU a lot because they had the highest percent enrollment of Native American students anywhere. So they were trying to, this is the early 80s and stuff.
Right.
Early to mid 80s. And so everything else was in state. This thing, it was a 10-week summer internship out at Lawrence Livermore. And I thought, well, what the heck? I haven't really been to California. Let's see what this is all about. And I was actually working in the magnetic fusion program out there where they have really big magnets to confine a plasma. I had a little bit of experience with ordinary low power continuous lasers when I was an undergrad there at NSU. And so I guess based on that, my resume that I put together, I was assigned to use, they had these pulse lasers. They had a pulse ruby laser that they would use to pulse, and by scattering off of the electrons of the plasma, you could measure the plasma temperature, the plasma density, and a lot of other stuff. So I fell in love with big physics. I guess I made a really big impression on them, and so they wanted to try to find a way of keeping me there. They put me in contact with somebody. So there was, at that time, there's the world's biggest laser at that time being built and finished. It was called the Nova laser. It was at Livermore from 1984 to 1998, I believe, was when it was decommissioned. And it was something kind of new and starting up. It was actually kind of exciting because there was a picture of that laser in my modern physics book when I was a student at MSU. And it was just like, oh, wouldn't that be cool someday to do that? So anyway, they hired me. I went to graduate school part-time at University of California, Davis, and applied physics and started cutting my teeth on the world's biggest, most powerful laser out there at Livermore, and hired on as a physicist, and then came to Los Alamos. So I continued that until 1996 and came to Los Alamos. My wife's family my wife was from New Mexico, and my family, of course, is all from Oklahoma. So it was a lot closer to be here in New Mexico. And so I worked at Los Alamos National Lab, also as a physicist in the laser fusion program, and just retired now at the end of 2022.
Wow. It's quite an accomplishment on fascination with science and physics. I've always been kind of passionate to quantum physics and I guess everyone watched the old show Quantum Leap back in the day.
Oh yeah, Quantum Leap, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Even though, I've worked in this field for 38 years, quantum mechanics is just not something that is an everyday kind of experience for people. Yeah. Special relativity and general relativity, the stuff from Einstein, is not something in our everyday experience. So even having worked in the field for nearly 4 years, it's all still kind of weird and strange to me. But if you do experiments and you go out and make measurements, sure enough, that's exactly how things behave whenever you're kind of in these extreme conditions or extreme areas.
Awesome. Well, tell me a little bit about your family on your Cherokee history side of things. Your Cherokee family. Any background of first language speakers, or everybody has a cultural moment with their family.
Sure. So my Cherokee connection is through my maternal grandfather, Lewis Powell. He was born and raised in Sequoia County around Sallisaw and Sadie, Oklahoma, down through there, Brent, Vian, a little bit outside through there. His mother was from McKee. He was born and raised on his family's allotment. And then sometime, I believe it was in 1945, there really wasn't any jobs there at Sequoia County, so he moved my mother and her siblings to West Tulsa. So everybody basically stayed there as all of his kids and my mother and aunts and uncles, together with all their kids, stayed there. So I do remember probably when I was still a small boy in elementary school, my grandfather telling me about the fact that he said his grandparents, but he probably meant his great grandparents, had come over on the Trail of Tears and told me some stories like that. I heard stories. I knew that we were Cherokee. There were over there in the Red Fork area, there's probably about a third of the students that I went to school with who were either identifiably Indian or their parents or their grandparents were. There were a lot of natives, Cherokees and Creeks and Choctaws and a few other from other tribes. And so it was not too unusual to find other people to talk to growing up over there. We had a couple of Native American churches in the area, which a lot of other places in Tulsa don't. So there was a Creek Baptist church that was not too far from our house, and there was a Methodist Choctaw church that was just right down the road from that one. So we knew that we were Cherokee. So one of the exciting things for me when I started to go to NSU was to really learn more about Cherokee culture. I had thought I wanted to go into pre-med and to go to medical school. No one really in my family, at least not my immediate family, had gone to college. I had an aunt that actually had gone to NSU to work on her nursing degree, but then she moved away to California. And so in terms of learning how to apply to college and do all that stuff, or what the college life was about, I really didn't have anybody else to talk to besides teachers in high school. And so I was excited to be with other Cherokees, learning about the culture. Because I had planned early on to go to medical school, I wanted to be able to come back and work for the Cherokee people and do that as a medical doctor. So whenever I found out that we had to have a language requirement in general, for a bachelor's degree, Cherokee, there was basically an entire Cherokee major, like people would have, French or German majors or something like that. And so I said, "Oh, can I take Cherokee as my foreign language requirement?" And they said, "Yeah." So I took 2 semesters of Cherokee from the late Reverend Martin Cochran from Stillwell, Flukagama, Chicasa, and had tried to sort of keep up with my language skills over the years. And then in 1984, I moved out to the Bay Area of California and, tried my best to try to keep up with my language skills. Came back to Oklahoma maybe once a year or so. It was a little bit more challenging, or maybe every couple of years. Did whatever I could to try to maintain connections with my Cherokee friends and my Cherokee family, and try to continue on with that.
Absolutely. Well, it's from an at-large citizen standpoint, what are some of the things that you're seeing? I know social media plays a big component on trying to keep folks engaged. I know we're in election season, but there's a lot of dialogue thrown out there. sometimes an at-large citizen might look at things differently, more cultural versus what's going on here of the everyday life, how resolutions affect our lives here inside of Cherokee Nation. How do we get that message back out to them? So when people vote, it does make a difference. And at large make up, what is it, over a third or almost two-thirds?
Two-thirds, I think two-thirds, yeah, something like
Of
that of the population.
a population of a voting base, and that can really influence things.
Yeah, some of those at large are just immediately outside the 14 county jurisdiction on the reservation, and they're still close. Maybe they just live like in West Tulsa. I think our house was 4 miles from the Cherokee Nation reservation border, growing up there in West Tulsa. So some people are closer. It's a little bit easier to try to connect, but whenever you're living 1,000 miles away or more, I think the best way to social media plays an important part. Shows like this play an important part, and other programs and outreach efforts. What one finds a lot of times, though, there are people out in some of the at-large groups or in other places you try to meet them, and they're not Cherokee. They have some family story. They're not actually Cherokee citizens, and you dig into it a little bit deeper, and it sounds phony. It sounds like, this is not right. Some mysterious Cherokee great-grandmother who was full blood, who jumped off the Trail of Tears and all that stuff, and knowing more about genealogy and knowing that those types of things didn't happen, knowing more of our history, our documentation, all the dozens of censuses and rolls we had over the years. So that has been, as an at-large citizen, trying to connect with other Cherokees and talk to them and learn. I mean, even you and I talked a little bit. We found out that we're related, and most, somewhere if we go back enough in genealogy, all of us are related. And if not related by blood, we're related by clan, related by marriage, have other relations and stuff like that. And so these so-called pretendians, they don't have any kind of connections like that.
Absolutely.
For years, I would just roll my eyes when I heard these stories about people with their mythological Cherokee ancestors, and then at some point it started really bugging me more because they went beyond just having a family story to try to capitalize on that and to try to have some kind of a gain or an advantage, and they just check the box somewhere, and nobody would check. So I'm in the past 4 or 5 years, I've been sort of marginally involved in a group that's called TAF, Tribal Alliance Against Frauds, and to try to, you're not going to go after Uncle Billy Bob, who has some kind of a Cherokee story that he's telling at the backyard barbecue that's not true, but it's people that are really high profile, that are academics, and others that are making up some kind of a mythological story and trying to benefit from that. So it is challenging, I think, sometimes for at-large citizens to sort through that and say, a lot of this stuff these family stories that some people come up with are just simply not true. Social media, I think, is a great way to try to help reach people and to teach people and other things like that. And otherwise, I think it'd be great to have people try to come back at least once a year to visit family and friends within Cherokee Nation and try to make a deeper connection beyond what you can do just with via social media.
Absolutely. Well, one thing it was always concerning to me, it's been in the back of my head, is, what was it, 2 years ago, every Cherokee Nation citizen got $2,000. And I mean, it was like the gold rush, I guess you could say, basically. And I mean, I heard stories of folks that were Chinese, different dialect, or I can't say the dialects, showing up down there at the complex, standing in line, everybody thinking they're going to get $2,000 and raising their hand, I'm Cherokee. With that being said, I was concerned there was such a volume of folks wanting to get registered. Do you think it's even possible that some folks could have slipped through, and they just being so overwhelmed, say, this group of folks, pass them on through it, get their citizenship?
I'm aware of the fact that a good friend of mine that I met back in college, we crossed past briefly. It's David Cornsilk, who's one of the chief candidates. I know that he actually was doing an audit as part of his job when he was in the Cherokee Nation registration department, and he came across several thousand, and he'd only gotten through part of the alphabet, who should not have actually gotten either their CDIB or their cards. So it's certain that there could be some that slipped through. All right, so it's not unusual. You know, historically, we have had, whenever people were aware that there might be money around by claiming Cherokee, this is what happened in the early 1900s. There was advertisements all over the U.S. For the so-called Guion Miller roll. It's for Eastern Cherokee applications. That was money that was still due to Cherokees who were still in the East after 1835, prior to the removal. So they were looking for people all over. Well, there were tens of thousands of people that applied falsely claiming to be Cherokee. And fortunately, you know, there were other roles. I don't think that they were aware how sophisticated we were as a tribe of all of the censuses and rolls and things like that. So the commissioners that were doing this were cross-checking and ensuring that, yes, indeed, you are entitled to this, or no, your claim is completely false and there's nothing to substantiate it. You're just trying to get money. And unfortunately, there were unscrupulous lawyers that were trying to do that. So my concern is if there were, you know, already before several years ago, if there was up to 5,000 people that have become Cherokee citizens without the proper documentation according to our Constitution, then how many more might there be? I know the audit had only gone A through F and hadn't finished the alphabet, so that's only like 1/4 of the alphabet. So there could be of order 4 times as many. And yeah, we should probably make sure that there aren't any mistakes in that, especially whenever we're talking about funding that's going out to citizens. We want to make sure that they're all legitimate citizens.
Absolutely, because I mean, if they're right now, if there are any in that situation, they're possibly registered to vote and getting ready to vote. So
very true.
It's kind of the domino effect when it comes to that. So, and I don't know. I mean, do they ever do registration audits? I wonder. I mean, going back and just kind of looking back once in a while. I know IRS does it for things. So.
The only one I would know who is familiar with that, it was David Cornsilk, who had been part of the registration department under contract, and part of his contract was to audit that. So at one time there was at least that, but nothing has really been done. I think that there's a technicality that once a CDIB has been issued, the Bureau of Indian Affairs doesn't allow you to undo a CDIB. But we, at least in terms of our legal system, we still have the right to deny somebody as being a citizen or not. So whether they get a blue card and actually become citizens, I think we still have some control over that. Gotcha. I think it's worthwhile to try to go back and audit.
Yeah. Well, you've got a presentation you want to show, so I'm going to try to pull this up here.
Okay.
And discuss that. I find it pretty fascinating. So
yeah, when I've tried to talk to my family and friends about what I do, it's kind of mind-blowing still. And after having been in the field for 4 years, some of the stuff that the conditions we achieve and these big giant lasers and everything else, it's still kind of mind-boggling and mind-blowing to me. So whenever people ask my family members what I do, they say, oh, he's a nuclear physicist or he's a rocket scientist or whatever. And none of those are quite the right description. So I'm a plasma physicist, and I mostly use lasers to be able to produce plasmas and interact with them and to do that. So just real briefly, here's a slide on what a plasma is. You know, so lightning is a plasma, a welder's torch can get hot enough to be a plasma, and some really hot flames can be a plasma, which I'll describe. Neon and fluorescent lights are in a plasma state. People have played with a plasma ball before. This glass globe, you put your hands on it, you see all these sparks kind of coming to it. The sun and the stars are plasma, and in fact, 99% of the visible universe, if we're seeing something glowing out there, it's because it's a plasma. So plasma is sometimes called a fourth state of matter. We have solids, liquids, and gases that we've learned since we're in elementary school. Oh, go back to that.
Oh, go back to one. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
There we go.
And so basically what a plasma means is it's any kind of matter. It could be kind of a gas, or it could be really dense like a solid, an incredibly dense solid. And it's where the electrons get stripped off the atoms. So you have this whole soup of positive and negative charges that sort of act like a fluid, except for they have electric and magnetic behavior. And so that gives it some really very exotic behavior that you don't see in ordinary matter. So go ahead and go to the next slide.
All right.
And so specifically, what we're trying to do is to achieve fusion energy, control fusion energy in the lab, to be able to provide a clean, limitless supply of energy for mankind for the next thousands, millions of years, how long we're on the planet. So fusion is the energy source of the sun and the stars. Show a picture of those. And I've drawn a picture of an atom over here. There's the positively charged nucleus. So the protons are the ones with a charge in there, +1 charge. Neutrons are neutral particles. They're slightly more massive than protons. The electrons are really very lightweight. They're about 2,000 times lighter than a proton, but they're negatively charged with the exact opposite charge of a proton. And so if you're in this plasma state, the electrons are no longer attached to the atom. They're sort of floating around, and everything's just a big soup of positive and negative charges going around. So next slide. So if you want to try to produce fusion energy, and I'll describe what fusion is, it's not easy. So the two atoms, if you've got these two nuclei that are positively charged, they naturally want to repel. We've learned that since elementary school. Like charges repel. So it's opposites that attract, but like charges repel. So if you have two positively charged nuclei, they mostly want to push each other apart. If you force them together with enough force, then they will fuse together, they'll stick together. So I show the easiest fusion reaction to get going. It is two different isotopes of hydrogen. One of them is deuterium. It's got a positively charged proton and then a single neutron. The other one is tritium. It's still got just a single proton, making it hydrogen, but it's got two neutrons. So it's 3 times as heavy as ordinary hydrogen. They fuse together temporarily, and then you get out helium plus a neutron plus a lot of energy. And this is the ordinary helium that you use to blow up balloons. So where the energy is coming from, if you were to carefully weigh the deuterium and tritium before the reaction and the neutron and the helium after the reaction, you'd find out that there's some mass missing, that the others are a little bit heavier. What's happened to that mass? It's been converted to pure energy according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. So that's where the energy comes from. But just to be able to get this reaction going, and this is kind of the easiest reaction to get going that will burn quickly and stuff like that, requires temperatures of like 100 million degrees centigrade to ignite it on Earth. And so that's 10 times hotter than the center of the sun. So next slide. So if we can get fusion and have it controlled, this is a slide demonstrating how powerful it is and how much energy content it has. If you have a barrel of water, which is 42 gallons, seawater, whatever you want, lake water, a mud puddle water if you want, it's hot H2O. Out of that, just naturally occurring, about 3/4 of an ounce is heavy water. Instead of being H2O, it's D2O with deuterium. If you were to burn that completely in a fusion reaction, just that little 3/4 ounce of water provides the same energy equivalent of burning 32,000 gallons of oil. If you had a thimble full of deuterium and you could burn that by fusion, it is the energy content equivalent of 20 tons of coal. And people who live there in Cherokee Nation are probably familiar with the coal-fired electric plant outside of Muskogee as you're driving towards there, and you see it a lot. And so that puts out a lot of pollution. It's actually not really very good for people with respiratory problems like me. So this is a clean energy source. There isn't any pollution. There's no radioactive, long-lived waste that you have to worry about. Next slide. So there are various approaches to be able to confine a plasma. So once you get something at 100 million degrees, or even tens of millions of degrees, the pressure in that just makes it want to expand out, and it would cool off as soon as it expands out. So what happens in the sun and the stars, they're so incredibly massive that just the gravity confines that, and it's confining it for billions of years. Our sun is about 4.5 billion years old, according to measurements and according to astrophysics and things like that. If you want to have that happen on Earth, we can't get something that massive, so we're going to have smaller devices. So there's an approach called magnetic confinement, where they take a fairly low density gas of hydrogen, turn it into a plasma, have these big giant magnets that are confining that, and you get it confined for anywhere from many seconds to maybe minutes or something like that to try to generate fusion energy. The approach that I've been doing research in for most of my career for the past 38 years is what's called inertial confinement, or sometimes it's called laser fusion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take some little sphere, I'm making it like it's this big, but it's actually like the size of half the size of a BB or so, containing the hydrogen fuel. You heat up the outside of it either with the lasers directly or produce some X-rays, and the X-rays will do that. It makes a plasma atmosphere that sort of gives it the rocket effect, and the whole thing will just implode. And once it squeezes down, you've compressed and heated the fuel, and it'll have some finite time before it actually will expand out. And that finite time is set by how massive the material is around it or how dense it is. And so the confinement time there is only about 100 trillionths of a second. It's just over in a really brief flash. And you can release a tremendous amount of energy in that brief time. So next slide, Jeff.
Okay.
So the experiments that I've been doing since about 2010 or so was whenever it started to get online, have been done out at Livermore, California. It's called the National Ignition Facility, or NIF for short. It's now the world's largest, most powerful laser. The predecessor laser before that out at Livermore was called the Nova laser. And NIF has got about 30 or 40 times more energy than Nova did. The whole facility is huge. It's the size of 3 football fields. There's 192 laser beams producing 500 trillion watts of laser power in a few billionths of a second. Just to put that in perspective, the entire electrical output of the United States is only about 4 trillion watts. And so it's like over 100 times more power. And the reason why we don't black out the lights in the entire United States is this is only in a few billionths of a second. It's not. So a laser really is taking and sort of compressing the energy down in time is what it's doing. So just to give you an idea for this is called a solid state glass laser. Mm-hmm. The thing that makes it active are those pink sheets of glass you see in that middle top picture. Each of the laser beams are about 1.5 feet tall by 1.5 feet wide, and there's 192 of them. That laser comes out as infrared light, and what we've learned over the years is that infrared light doesn't couple to these fusion capsules really very well. It's better if it's in the green or ultraviolet. So that bottom middle picture of that big giant crystal you see, it's a special crystal called potassium dihydrogen phosphate, or KDP, that gets grown as a single crystal. It's gigantic, and they'll slice it up and stuff like that. So if you've ever played with a laser pointer and you shine it through a piece of glass, the laser pointer is red or green, whatever color you have, and you shine it through glass, it comes out red or green on the other side, right? Mm-hmm. So these crystals, if you shine lasers through at a high enough power, if you shine it through at low power, a red laser will come out red. If you shine it through at really high power, it'll turn the red laser into green. And if you let some of that red come through and you take another crystal, you can combine the green and the red to make an ultraviolet, something that's deeper than blue, shorter wavelength than blue. So it's some fun physics, weird physics. All of that gets focused down into a big 30-foot diameter vacuum vessel where we actually do the fusion experiments. And so that's my expertise, is blowing up stuff with lasers and making all these measurements. If you look at the figure on the left where the whole building is or whatever, that 30-foot diameter vacuum vessel is that little tiny sphere that's kind of towards the bottom right of that. So we're taking this giant laser and taking all that energy, and what you see in the bottom right picture is one of our fusion targets. It's about the size of a pencil eraser. We're taking all this energy and power and focusing it down into that target. Next slide. Okay. So that target is something that we call a Hohlraum. It's a German word that means empty cavity or empty room. A hollow room, I think, is what the literal meaning is. And so this is a diagram on the left. So this thing is made out of some metal. Gold works well, tungsten works well. Anything that's kind of a heavy metal works well to be able to make this material out of. And we focus 96 beams coming from the top, 96 beams coming from the bottom. And there's this little pellet containing hydrogen fuel in the middle of it. That's about half the size of a BB. It's about 2 millimeters in diameter. Now, my expertise is really how the lasers actually make the plasma in the first place, how it interacts with the plasma. There's some funny things. If you remember from Ghostbusters, there's this line in there of, "Oh, don't cross the stream,"
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's an interesting phenomenon that we discovered back in the 90s. If you cross two laser beams in a flowing plasma, what we don't show there in this picture, you can see it on the little tiny target. There's some holes in the end of that little gold Coke can or whatever that is being held up over the target, called a laser entrance hole. That's where our lasers come through. Well, plasma flows out from there. If you cross two beams in a flowing plasma, you can actually get energy to go from one set of beams to another set of beams. So we use that to actually switch some energy from what we call the outer cone beams that are hitting closer towards the laser entrance hole to putting some more energy and power in towards the inner beams. And that helps to keep the implosion nice and symmetric. You want it to stay around while it's flying in. Now, what I'm showing on the right is actual data. This is we'll take a few of the laser beams and hit some kind of a metal foil outside the hole ROM target, make some x-rays, shine it through the target, but now we'll take and streak that down in time through a very fast camera. This camera has 5 trillionths of a second time resolution. So what you're seeing is the actual shell imploding that has the hydrogen fuel in it. And there at the very bottom, you see this kind of a bright flash that's happening. The stuff is going wider. Everything that's dark is a shadow. It's the shadow of the shell. So that shell is imploding at 400 kilometers per second. I know a lot of people aren't used to 400 kilometers per second. So it is actually 250 miles per second. That would be like driving from Muskogee to Oklahoma City, back to Muskogee, all in a single second. It's just, even though I've been working in this field for nearly 40 years, it's still, mind-blowing to me. So we can make measurements like that. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you some more. So that was a streaked measurement with shining x-rays through it to be able to take a picture. This is the world's fastest movie camera that we have also developed. I've had some development effort in both streaked imaging as well as this gated imaging and a few other imaging techniques. Each of these movies or pictures have a frame time of 30 trillionths of a second. Just to give you an idea for how fast that is. So we know that light goes 186,000 miles per second. In a single second, light will only travel about a foot. That's a nanosecond. I'm sorry, in a nanosecond, it'll travel about a foot. That's a billionth of a second.
Wow.
So 100 trillionths of a second, light would only travel about an inch. So this is like a third of an inch or a quarter of an inch or something like that. So light's not going, so we're really freeze framing the action. And you can see this capsule. So these are kind of like different strips on the picture on the left showing as the capsule's imploding and it's getting smaller and smaller and shrinking. So we can sort of see how round it is. On the pictures on the right, the top two are from one experiment where things weren't quite tuned up and the capsule had swung a little bit from us pushing on it from the top and pushing on it from the side at 2 different times. And it kind of gives it a slight diamond shape to it. It's not round, and that doesn't compress up the fuel and heat it up as well as keeping it round. The bottom frames are kind of round. And actually, if you see in this picture, it looks like it's got a couple of little bright bands on the top and bottom of that bottom right picture that look like the seams of a baseball. Those are actually tiny scars from how the capsule was being held. And so these types of pictures help us to learn a lot about what's going on. But just to kind of point out some sense of scale for this, that bottom right picture at that point, the target is about the width of 3 human hairs. That's how small the plasma is. So it's, go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. So on December 5th, 2022, actually just a little bit after I had retired, so I wasn't involved in this particular experiment, but I've been involved in a predecessor experiment where we'd gotten almost up to the threshold of ignition, and that appeared in a publication this past year. So on December 5th of 2022, we achieved what's called fusion ignition. This research has been going on since the early 1970s, so it's over 50 years of research in this. They put in a unit of energy called 2 megajoules of laser energy output input. The target yielded 3 megajoules of fusion energy output, so it means that it put out about 1.5 times more energy than what was input. The plasma temperature got up to about 250 million degrees Fahrenheit. People are a lot more familiar with Fahrenheit than they are centigrade and stuff. That's about 10 times hotter than the center of the sun. The density of that hot plasma that's there got up to be about 80 times as dense as water. Water has a density of about a gram per cubic centimeter, gram per cc. So gold has a density of about 19. We'll just call it 20 times 20 grams per cubic centimeter. So it's like 4 times as dense as gold is. So it's very dense. It got to extreme pressures, 570 billion times our atmospheric pressure. So the core of the Earth is at about 4 million times atmospheric pressure. So this is 570 billion times atmospheric pressure. That's over twice the pressure at the center of the sun. The fusion power output during that 100 trillionths of a second when this was burning was 40 quadrillion watts. So that's 40 followed by 15 zeros. It's, mind-boggling numbers. So this thing that we called ignition, you're doing work on the plasma as the thing is imploding, it's heating it up. You probably pumped up a bicycle pump really quick, and you can feel the cylinder getting hot, so like that. So it's kind of like that, or like a diesel engine works. If it compresses it quickly, it'll heat stuff up. So there's that heating. There's the heating from the fusion, and you want the two of those to be greater than the thing is cooling off, and that's the point where it ignites, and the temperature starts increasing because it'll get hotter. So this is a very nonlinear effect. So if you double the temperature, you don't just double the fusion output, you might get 10 times more fusion output. If you quadruple the temperature, a factor of 4, you don't get just 4 times the fusion power out, you might get 100 times out in power. And so you really want it to be heating up, and that is what we call ignition, whenever all the energy that it's producing is faster than the way it can lose and cool off. And so you want to make sure that that's happening faster than the thing can expand apart and start to cool off. And so we finally, after basically my entire career, we've finally have achieved ignition. And a lot of us said ignition before retirement. We wanted to stay in the field and see it through.
So what's the next step with that? Is it like 20 years out before they can start to harness a little bit of that?
Well, it could, if we're both old enough, we kind of remember the Apollo space program and the investments made there. There was a race to get a man to the moon when we just barely started kind of entering into space and flying rockets and stuff like that. So if there was a large investment in this, it could be much sooner, but there's still challenges. So the way that this would work for a power plant is kind of like a car engine. You would shoot maybe several of these targets per second. There's a company that I'm consulting for out of the Bay Area called Exemer Energy. Their scheme is actually a target once every 2 seconds, which is a little bit more feasible to me. You want to have the laser itself be very efficient so that when you plug it into the wall and it's drawing some electricity to operate, you want to make sure it's as efficient as possible. And you actually want to get target gain instead of 1.5. You'd really like to be more like 50 or 100. That's actually easier to get more or less once you get a bigger laser. So NIF was sort of built right to be there on the cliff where you're bouncing off heating and cooling, and hopefully you're getting more heating than cooling. So it's just sort of barely gets you up over the cliff. We might be able to get a little bit more out from that. But with a bigger laser, it becomes easier because the energy it holds together for a longer time because it's got more density that's there. So so it could be It could be as fast as 10 years. The company that I'm consulting for part-time thinks that if they can they've got a lot of investors. They're vying for some federal funding from the Department of Energy, and they believe that we could at least get a demo plant online within the next decade after you start building it.
Wow. Well, I think I remember either on 60 Minutes or a show like that, they were talking about, like you were saying, something the size of a BB, or it was even the head of a hair,
Yeah,
but it had to be a perfect spear. And they were talking about how they were using whatever to curve it and stuff like that to make it a perfect spear, as I guess where the laser would go into that. And I found that pretty fascinating.
yeah. So there's material science and how do you do all this manufacturing and make something perfect. Another fortunate thing is once you get, so for this demo, this NIF experiment, we were trying to get away with using as little laser energy as possible and saying how small of a laser can we build and get something to actually ignite. Fortunately, so once you start to scale up towards a bigger laser and a bigger capsule, the whole, what we believe now is that the whole physics process is a little bit more forgiving. It doesn't have to be necessarily as quite so perfect. It can tolerate some roughness, but some of the experiments now will be kind of trying to look at that and saying how tolerant, how robust are we to little imperfections here and there, and how perfect does it have to be made, and trying to imagine making thousands of these per day, so that you're shooting one every 2 seconds or several times a second, depending on how much gain, how much fusion you're getting out of each, and how big your laser is, and a lot of different parameters. You could do a reactors design and play all these what if games for how fast you want to reparate the system and everything else. And so anyway, it's been exciting research and it's fun. I think I've got maybe 1 or 2 more slides.
Yeah. Yep. I'll go over here.
Yeah, we won't do the last slide. So on the left is an artist's depiction of what one of these whole ROM targets look like. You got the lasers coming in. There's this heavy metal cylinder that's there, and the capsule's inside, and the laser beams are hitting the inside wall of that gold can, and lighting it up. And on the right is the actual data. It's just X-ray self-emission. So, you've been around a campfire, you've seen something get red hot, you've seen things get white hot. Our things get so hot that they're X-ray hot, so they glow in X-rays as opposed to infrared or visible. Everything that's got heat is glowing in some kind of a wavelength of electromagnetic radiation. So out of one of the ends of the right end of that laser interest hole is just hot plasma that's streaming out. You can see all the laser spots in through there. You can actually see a seam down the middle of the target that looks like a really sharp arc. That's where they join the 2 halves of the whole ROMs together. We jokingly call half of a whole ROM a half ROM, like the whole thing as a whole, but it's spelled differently. And then this one wasn't really, this particular experiment wasn't designed to try to get a lot of fusion energy, but that little tiny bright spot you see there is an imploded capsule that's shining bright. So we're actually making a miniature star or sun here on the Earth that lasts about 100 trillionths of a second. It's got the same types of densities, temperatures, pressures, and the same kind of physical processes. So beyond fusion energy, you can actually study some astrophysics up close and personal in the laboratory and reproducibly, and try to understand better how some of those go. And I've got one other, I think is a cool picture to show. And this is actually from an experiment at a smaller laser that's up in Rochester, New York, at the University of Rochester. It's called the Omega laser. A lot of times we'll actually take an ordinary digital Nikon camera or whatever you have that's a digital camera, heavily filter it, because stuff is so bright it'll blind your eyes. But you put enough filters on this, you can open up the shutters and you won't get any light from the ordinary room light through. But whenever the experiment goes off, it's just staying on. So what you see at the center, so the lasers themselves are ultraviolet. They're invisible to the sensor of the camera, so you don't see the lasers in there. You see that miniature star going off, and it is so hot. So what you see, all these metal things are pointing in. These are our diagnostics measuring X-rays or scattered light, or measuring the particles, the fusion particles that are coming off. Just to give you some sense of scale, the one that kind of is towards at about the 2 o'clock position or so, up and through there, that's about a foot away from the target. But it's so hot, what you see around the tips of each and every one of those diagnostics is this little pink glowing thing that's makes kind of like a bow shock around it. That is actually plasma. So the X-rays from this little target, this little miniature fusion target that's going off, are ablating off some and making a plasma on the end of that, and that's colliding with the plasma that's streaming out, and so you get these little pink bow shocks around the tips of each and every one of those diagnostics. I sometimes put this up as my cover photo on Facebook, and
Yeah.
and people comment on it. But so it's some really cool stuff. It's been very exciting, and it's exciting that could actually, we've actually demonstrated it now in the laboratory. We know that the science behind it is feasible. And then the question is the rest of the engineering and technology getting we have pretty efficient lasers out there that have a good wall plug efficiency. The NIF laser wasn't intended to actually be a fusion reactor, so it doesn't have good wall plug efficiency, but we know how to make much more efficient lasers. The question is making them cheap enough and making the targets cheap enough and good enough such that this would be competitive with fossil fuel types of approaches for electricity production.
Absolutely. Well, wrapping this up, we're kids of definitely of the 80s. I mean, you had, first of all, the Real Genius movie came out with lasers and so forth and so on. And then in the 90s,
Back to the Future as well. And
Back to the Future. And then you have a Chain Reaction with Keanu Reeves, which was along the same lines of getting a reaction. And then there was, in that movie, it's something that stood out to me was Morgan Freeman. They played kind of the Men in Black of wanting to control this energy. The scientists make this, but you can't just release that to the world immediately without crashing society from, you have to ease everybody off, wing everybody off coal and in oil and so forth and so on. But, and then of course you've got Iron Man Man with his
got his little
fusion
plasma reactor inside of his chest.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll scale it down that small ever.
Yeah.
It's difficult to get the fusion reaction going. You need these high temperatures, and so you need and then the particles that get released are pretty energetic, so it won't be scaled down like a Mr. Fusion that's on that's you're throwing some beer cans and some banana peels in for the Back to the Future or inside of Iron Man's chest. But in terms of clean energy and having the nice thing about fusion energy right now with the fossil fuels, you have to have that resource there locally. There's some countries that have large reserves and others that don't. And so there's always this battle of, who's got it? How much are they going to set the price? Whereas here, the fuel is available to everybody, and it's just the technology instead. And so at least it takes that out of the equation. Anybody can get access to the fuel and do this. It's nothing special. And it doesn't have to be some, it could be any water source. It doesn't have to be seawater. It could be just anything. So it's an exciting time. I'm glad to have helped to have some contributions to this over the past 38 years of my career. And, whenever, when I was a kid, I'm sure a lot of kids did this, you get some firecrackers, and I'd try to get some bottle rockets and see how many bottle rockets it would take to launch a little green army man up and to get it going or blow up things. And so I'm kind of doing that now as an adult on a bigger scale. I'm blowing up stuff with the world's giant lasers. And so it's been a great career. And,
well, one last thing. What does it mean to be Cherokee to you? And then we'll just wrap it up with that.
Okay. What's it mean to be Cherokee to me? So, first of all, so up until about 10 years ago, before I'd gotten into genealogy a bit and things like that, and trying to look at those roots, you bump into somebody and they'd say, "Oh, I'm Cherokee too," and sometimes it'd be some of these BS stories of people that were just not true. But others, when they were legit, it might be like you're bumping into somebody from your own state when you're on travel to New York or something like that. You say, "Oh, there's a fellow Okie." So it didn't mean as much. But since doing genealogy and getting into that and starting to talk to other friends, either friends that I know personally or friends like you and others that I've met through Facebook, and you find out we share these ancestors. We had our ancestors intermarried. They lived in the same village. You can find all these different historic connections. And so it's really been a lot more like a family connection to me.
Mhm.
It is, our culture, our history, our language are all incredibly rich. Um, I have really, probably the past 10 years, I've tried to focus on improving my language skills some more so I can help some beginning students a little bit. And then when I can't, I try to point them to some of my friends that are fluent first language speakers. I'm also, I feel very strongly about tribal sovereignty, not only for Cherokee Nation, also for the other two federally recognized Cherokee tribes, United Katua Band and the Eastern Band, and other federally recognized tribes throughout the United States. And so when people start to make claims of being Native American and are trying to gain politically or gain financially from those, and they're not legitimate. We call them pretendians. It's very dangerous. It means that basically, if we're to the point where somebody can make any wild claim they want of being Native American, or especially being Native, or being Cherokee, and they're not, and they're able to benefit from it,
Mhm.
then that is a real attack on our tribal sovereignty. And I feel like it is probably one of our next biggest threats of tribal sovereignty. I've seen this grow over since I was in college, just from rolling my eyes at some people's family stories that just didn't make any sense, to really seeing people being very aggressive and trying to make claims when they had no right to do that. So that has really emboldened me to not just stay quiet and to speak out more against people that are frauds and are trying to
Definitely.
benefit off of being Cherokee. But we have a beautiful language, beautiful culture, a fascinating history that's had its own share of ups and downs and drama and everything else going on. And yet we have survived. And so, we have our ancestors fought to try to preserve our tribe and fought to be able to preserve our access to the lands and fought to be able to preserve our language. And it really just behooves us to be able to continue on with that fight and do what we can.
Awesome. Well, with that being said, I just want to say what to you on having you on today and everything. And for everyone out there, we're going to be doing a lot more interviews with citizens and just different variety of things coming up in the next few months. So be looking for us, and what